What is slam poetry? Well, if you ask the dictionary, it'll say that poetry is the art of rhythmical composition, and in addition, slam is a violent and often noisy impact. But how can slam poetry be just loud poetry? How can slam poetry be just poetry when in fact, if you ask the up-and-coming rapper living on the streets of LA, he'll say that slam poetry was the key that unlocked the lock to the world he could not possibly see because he was stuck on the corner of Loser Avenue and Failure Street. How can slam poetry be just poetry? Because if you ask that child minority, the troubled ones, going from juvie to juvie, ask them how they possibly survived, they will reply that slam poetry gave them freedom behind locked cells, a messy, violent, noisy freedom that rattled the chains against convictions that society handed to them from the day they set foot on this planet. How can slam poetry be just poetry? Because if you ask me, the quiet girl sitting in the back right side of the classrooms next to the windows that look out on the world, I'll say that slam poetry was my savior that saved me from tying myself to train tracks of self-suppression as the oncoming train, the mindset of society, too large, fast, and uncaring to stop for people like me, billowing thick black smoke into the air as the oncoming train passes me by. Slam poetry. How could it be just poetry? Could it be just poetry? No. Slam poetry is poetry. Not just, because that implies that poetry is just enough to make the cut when in fact, poetry is overflowing in any container you try to confine it in. Overflowing is poetry because poetry is the art of rhythmical composition, written or spoken, scribbled down or said aloud by beautiful, imaginative, or elevated thoughts. And slam is the noise made when one thing comes into violent contact with another thing, which means slam poetry is when one thing, a rapper on the streets of LA, a child in juvie, the quiet girl that stands before you challenges or slams into another thing, a larger thing, a Goliath of a thing. And that slam is beautiful, that slam is imaginative, that slam is elevated. Because in fact it is poetry. It is slam poetry.